Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. Today I've got a story for you and then some reflections on the story. During the Year 11 exam period at my school, we operate a system called Crash, which essentially tips the entire school's timetabling on its head in order to allow for students, GCSE students who are about to take their exams, to allow them to spend as much time as possible with their subject teachers as close as possible to each of their exams. So it causes an enormous amount of disruption across the school, but we think it really helps. I mean, I do have my reservations about Crash. I mean, number one, my narrative with my Year 11s all year has been not to rely on cramming right before the exam. You know, since September, I was telling them that their habits, the habits that they establish early on in the year, will be the habits that determine whether they, experience exam success or not. So my narrative was always about establishing those habits early, settling into them and letting the habits do the hard work, just carry you through the year towards those exams. I said that cramming won't make a difference. That was my narrative throughout the year. But then obviously Crash is just a different word for cramming. Crash is teacher-led cramming, essentially. Also, it takes a real toll on students. It is such a hectic, busy, exhausting period, not only with the exams, but with all this Crash. And I look at, high-performance athletes. They would never do that much training right before an event, competition. They would train ferociously for a long period of time, have a training camp, but then, in the final week, ease off and rest. Rest is more important, really, than cramming in a load of additional training or studying right before an exam, perhaps. That said, this Crash system has had an incredible impact, an incredible positive impact on my school's Progress 8 score. And similar practices have been rolled out recently in other local schools, and I believe that they're experiencing a similarly positive effect. So, who am I to judge? Anyway, that's Crash. That's what we do during the exam period with Year 11. And it was the day before the third maths paper. So the third maths paper was on, I believe, the Wednesday morning, I think, or a Thursday morning. I can't remember now. But anyway, it was the day before, and we were doing some maths Crash in the morning. We had 3 hours. Well, the teachers were in Crash all day. They were going to see half of their group in the morning and the other half of their group in the afternoon, depending on what other exams those students had that day or the following day. And so I had half of my students in the morning. And in short, they didn't want to be there. They had history Crash. No, sorry, they had their GCSE history exam that afternoon, and then their final maths paper was the following morning. And they believed that, on the morning of their history exam, they should be spending as much time as possible doing history revision. And that's what they wanted to do. They did not want to be in maths, despite the fact that maths was only, a few hours after their history exam the following morning. They didn't want to be there. They wanted to be doing history. And I don't like to just shut down these sorts of debates. I like to give students a platform to voice their concerns within reason. And I did that. We had quite a lively debate, which on the student side was led predominantly by two girls. I think they'd been riling each other up for a while beforehand. They came in, spoiling for a debate, and they got one. And, I listened to all their concerns, but ultimately reiterated that a great deal of thought goes into this crash timetable. It is balanced fairly among the different subjects. They'd had history crash the day before, and they were only spending 2 hours with me that morning. They were going to have an additional hour of history crash right before their exam in the afternoon, and I reiterated that the third and final maths paper is tomorrow morning, So I've heard your concerns, but we are here to do maths. The crash timetable has been very, purposefully crafted. And us teachers, we've got your best interests in mind. We do believe we know what's best. Don't doubt us now right at the end. So, I put forward my strongest case and said, so we're doing maths. Okay, I've heard your concerns, but we're doing maths. Let's crack on, please. And, I turned to write something on the board or whatever, sort the projector out. Look back, they're all just sat there with their history books out. Most of them they've pulled the history books out of their bag. They're not giving any notice to the exam paper, the maths exam paper that I put in front of them, completely ignoring me, just doing their history work. And I didn't really know what to do in this moment because, I just sat down for a minute and had a little think. I didn't know whether to kind of re-engage them, try and get into argue with them a bit more, try and tell them off. I didn't know what to do. I had a wander around and indeed, most of the students were just doing history. They'd completely ignored me. What I ended up saying to them, I said, look, I can't physically force you to do maths. My only requirement during these 2 hours is that you use the time very wisely. If you're not going to do maths, you need to be using the time very wisely. So basically I capitulated, because I thought I'm not going to be able to force them. I'm not going to stand here and shout at them. And I thought that might be counterproductive anyway. They've got exams that day. I felt, like I was in a real kind of tricky situation. I felt the tension of a dilemma here, So anyway, that's what I said. I said, use the time wisely. And anyway, I went back to my laptop and I sent an email to some of the senior leaders within my department, one of whom is responsible, or largely responsible for, putting the crash timetable together and implementing and overseeing it. So I sent this email just to let them know what had gone on in my class. Basically that I had a rebellion on my hands, and I'd kind of capitulated. Well, anyway, I heard within seconds, I heard these thudding footsteps coming down the corridor, and one of these senior leaders, this teacher who's in charge of implementing the crash timetable, bursts into the room, out of breath, very scary. And let's just say, within a minute or so, the students were doing maths. She wasn't taking any of their nonsense whatsoever. I was very appreciative for her support, and the history books went away. In fact, students were given the choice. They were told that maths will be happening in this room. If you're in this room, you're doing maths. If you refuse to do maths, you're coming with me and you're going to sit at the back of my year 13 class. This was, the teacher who was supporting me here, who'd burst into the room. And my students didn't like the sound of that. So they backed down. They put their history books away and we did some maths for an hour or so. Very begrudgingly on their part. A lot of them were just kind of moodily going through the motions. I don't know how much thought they actually put into their maths. It was a very much a suboptimal situation, but we did it anyway. And I was very appreciative for the support from this teacher. So thank you if you're listening. However, at the end of the 2 hours, I was aware that, there was a very negative air in the classroom. It hadn't been a very positive experience for any of us. And they had their final maths exam the following morning. They were going to see me that morning. I wanted to and I've been teaching most of them for 3 years now. I don't like this kind of negative atmosphere with these students. So, I wanted to say something to try and make things a little bit better. And, I spoke my mind. I said, thank you for, in the end, doing some maths. Well done for doing that. I know it's not ideal, but, secretly, I'll also tell you that, in a way, I'm kind of proud of you. And this was true because the world needs more rebels. And I also believe that's true. And these students had rebelled And they'd done so in a way that would be seen as largely acceptable in society. They engaged me in debate, and after I tried to shut it down and say, no, you need to do this, they engaged in, passive resistance. They weren't throwing chairs around. They weren't being violent or aggressive or swearing or being offensive or whatever. They'd engage in debate, and then they just passively refused to do what I wanted them to do. They resisted. They staged a sit-in, basically. They're like, we're not doing this. And so secretly, I was proud of them, and I shared that with them. I wanted them to, and I do believe the world needs more rebels. I was speaking from the heart here. I mean, the world is rife with social injustices. There are still many systems of oppression which need to be challenged. People need to rebel against them in an acceptable way. And I felt that that's what my students were doing. They saw a system. They didn't like the crash timetable. They thought it wasn't right. Maybe even thought it was unfair that they were being required to do maths on the morning of their history exam. And they rebelled. They were doing the right sorts of things. So, yeah, I told them I was proud of them. And it got me thinking a little bit more, broadly on this question. I mean, if you agree with me that there are many social injustices still in the world that need to be challenged and protested against and rebelled against, people need to come together and work together to challenge these systems to try and make the world a better place for everyone. Rebels, if we need more people like that, then what should the education system be doing? What should we be doing in schools in order to ensure we get those sorts of people coming out the other end? I mean, it throws us deep into, philosophical and political territory straight away. Because, I mean, education, state education is part of the state apparatus, and if there are still, social injustices inherent within the state apparatus, it's not going to be within state education's interests to be producing rebels like this. I mean, I spoke about this a few episodes ago. The style of instruction that's employed in most schools, knowledge-rich, direct instruction or explicit instruction, whatever you want to call it, students sit and passively listen to an explanation and then just kind of go through the motions of applying it to questions and just following rules, basically. It imparts a certain set of ideas in students that isn't really going to turn them into these social justice rebels, which, I think the world needs more of. Instead it's going to turn them into people who, focus on uniformity and conformity and passive acceptance. Yeah, so how do we do it? I mean, I think there are two different approaches. You might say, okay, so teachers need to essentially do what Paulo Freire describes in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed or for the Oppressed. Again, I spoke about it a few episodes ago on the podcast. You might be familiar with the book. It is very famous. He had this idea that students should be working on problems that are problems with society. They need to have their eyes open to these problems, and they should engage constructively in dialogue with their teachers. And it's not just a top-down, passive transmission of knowledge from teacher to student, but it's kind of a collective struggle against these issues. So this resistance almost should begin in schools together collectively with the students. That's what Paulo Freire would suggest. But then on the other hand, that isn't what society looks like, really. I mean, if we've got this idea anyway that society kind of does still have these oppressive elements within it, and if we also believe that schools should mirror society, then perhaps schools should also have these, inherently oppressive elements within them. Schools should almost, I spent a whole episode talking about this much earlier in the podcast history, like way back. Maybe schools should almost play the part of the villain in order to give students a real, safe opportunity to practice rebelling. against those sorts of structures. Because, if you engage in this lovely, critical, project learning, socially aware, dialogue-based practice with your students in schools, like the sort of practice that Freire recommends, but that doesn't mirror, what society looks like, then students may come out of an education system like that and be completely unprepared for the real world. We want students to kind of get a taste of what the real world's actually like in schools. We want schools to mirror that to an extent, but at the same time empower them to rebel against what the real world is actually like. And how complicated is that? I'm barely capable of expressing it, let alone of thinking about a way that you could actually do that within a school. Have a school where the primary aim is to produce students who rebel against the school, constructively, respectfully, but in a way that ultimately aims to change the school system into one that is closer to what Freire was discussing in his book, so that they might then leave school and be in a strong position to go out and do the same thing in society as well, to change these structures, because they've had good practice in school against rebelling against those sorts of structures, because they were present in school as well. And then the final complication to add here is that, if you did manage to create a school system like that did mirror the oppressive aspects of society, but in a way that also encouraged students to rebel against those aspects so that they could go out into the real world and do the same and make the world a better place. If that was your aim, then you wouldn't actually be able to allow students to experience any success in that struggle within school, because you'll perpetually have new students coming through who need to benefit from the same system. You couldn't suddenly change, because then the new students coming through wouldn't benefit from that same style of education, and they might leave less prepared to go out into the real world and fight to make it a better place. Oh, this has been a big old ramble, hasn't it? Let's do a bit of a roundup. I had this experience in school a couple of weeks ago. My year 11s rebelling against the crash timetable. They were beaten into submission in the end. Not actually beaten, let's be clear. But they were convinced into studying maths in the end. And but I was proud of them nonetheless for rebelling. I think the world does need more rebels. And in fact, on reflection, I think that was a very good pedagogical experience, for them. I'm proud of them. Let's hope they go out into the world and do the same sorts of things. We need more troublemakers, don't we? Okay. Yes, a bit of a ramble. I do apologise. But hopefully there was some stuff in there that might have been of interest. I think there'll only be one more podcast episode now before the summer. No, there'll be two more. And I'll do a bit of an update on my situation in one of those episodes, which is changing quite a bit from next year. In a nutshell, I'm going to be doing a PhD, which is wonderful. I'm going to carry on some of the lines of inquiry that I started during my master's, which means I'll be dropping down to part-time teaching and very part-time teaching. I'll only be teaching one class a week, 5 hours of teaching a week. So I'll do a bit of an update on that within the next few episodes, because I think it will also impact how often I produce the podcast. We'll see. Okay, but I'll make sure it's all explained, especially for those of you who support me on the Patreon. Speaking of which, I should do my usual Patreon plea. This episode took a couple of hours to produce. I aim to produce a couple of episodes a month. If you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee once a month, so £2 or £3 once a month, then please consider signing up on Patreon to support me. And if you do sign up, you'll be helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot, but any contribution is greatly appreciated. And you'll also gain exclusive early access to videos of my recording sessions, if that sounds appealing. So there you go. We'll talk again in a couple of weeks' time. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media.
You can follow me on Twitter at Mr. BrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Mr. BrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.